I have always believed that loyalty was the cornerstone of marriage. The vows we take, the promises we make, they meant everything to me. But in the wake of my mother's death, as I struggled with grief and self-harm, I found myself isolated in my own home. My husband Marcus grew distant, just when I needed him most, while his best friend Jake stepped in with compassion. I never expected a moment of innocent comfort would be so catastrophically misunderstood. How quickly trust can shatter like glass, leaving only painful shards behind. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button to follow my journey from rock bottom to redemption. I grew up in the quiet suburbs of Philadelphia, in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other by name. My childhood was relatively normal, filled with summer barbecues, school activities, and family game nights. My mother was always my rock, the person I turned to for everything. She instilled in me values of honesty, compassion, and loyalty that would shape the man I would become. I met Marcus during my sophomore year of college. We were both studying business at Penn State, and we met at a mutual friend's party. There was an instant connection between us, something that felt like fate. He was charismatic, ambitious, and had this laugh that could light up an entire room. We started dating almost immediately, and it felt like I had found my other half. After graduation, we moved in together, and 3 years later we got married in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by friends and family. My mother cried tears of joy as she watched us exchange vows. She pulled me aside at the reception and told me how proud she was that I had found someone who seemed to love me as much as she did. Those words meant everything to me. The first 8 years of our marriage were mostly blissful. We bought a charming 2-story house in a nice neighborhood, advanced in our careers, and built a life that others envied. Marcus became a marketing executive at a prestigious firm, while I worked as a graphic designer for a publishing company. We traveled together, hosted dinner parties, and seemed like the perfect couple to everyone around us. Sure, we had our disagreements like any couple, but we always found our way back to each other. Marcus could be stubborn and sometimes prioritized work over our relationship, but his good qualities far outweighed these minor flaws. At least that is what I thought, until my world began to crumble around me. Everything changed when my mother called me one Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was shaking as she told me that what she thought was a persistent cold was actually stage 4 lung cancer. The doctors had given her 3 to 6 months. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. How could this be happening? She had never even smoked. The next 3 months were a blur of hospital visits, doctor appointments, and watching the strongest woman I knew fade away before my eyes. Marcus was supportive at first, accompanying me to the hospital and handling household responsibilities when I could not. But as weeks passed and my mother's condition worsened, he began to show signs of impatience. He would make comments about how I needed to prepare myself for the inevitable, or suggest that I was neglecting our relationship by spending so much time at the hospital. When my mother finally passed away, it was a rainy Sunday morning. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath. I called Marcus, who was at a work conference, and he said all the right things, but I could hear the relief in his voice that this chapter would soon be over. He returned that evening, held me as I cried, but within days was suggesting I should start moving on. The grief hit me harder than anything I had ever experienced. It felt physical, like a weight crushing my chest. I could barely get out of bed some days, and when I did, I moved through life like a ghost. I took bereavement leave from work, but when 2 weeks passed, Marcus began questioning when I would return to normal. That was when the darkness really began to take hold. The pain became so overwhelming that I needed some way, any way, to release it. One night alone in our bathroom, I made the first cut on my forearm. The physical pain provided a strange relief from the emotional torment, a momentary escape from the grief that threatened to consume me. I hid the marks with long sleeves, ashamed of my coping mechanism but unable to stop. As my depression deepened, Marcus became increasingly distant. He would come home later from work, spend weekends golfing with clients, and when we were together, he would scroll through his phone rather than engage with me. When I tried to talk about my feelings, he would change the subject or tell me I needed to snap out of it. It was during this painful period that Jake began to become a more frequent presence in our home. Jake and Marcus had been best friends since high school, practically brothers. He was going through a divorce of his own and would often stop by to hang out with Marcus, watch sports, or share a beer. Unlike Marcus, Jake seemed to notice my struggle. One evening when Marcus was working late, Jake found me crying in the kitchen. Instead of awkwardly excusing himself, he sat with me, let me talk about my mother, and shared stories of his own grief when his father died years earlier. There was no judgment, just compassion. As Marcus worked longer hours and spent less time at home, Jake would occasionally check in on me. He would bring coffee and sit on our porch talking about everything and nothing. These conversations became a lifeline for me, a reminder that someone still saw me as a person worth talking to, not just a problem to be fixed. I began to notice the first real cracks in our marriage when Marcus refused to attend a grief counseling session with me. My therapist had suggested it might help him understand what I was going through, but Marcus dismissed it as unnecessary. We had our first major argument that night, with him accusing me of dwelling on my loss instead of focusing on our future. His words cut deep. How could someone who claimed to love me be so callous about the loss of my mother? How could he expect me to just move on as if nothing had happened? That night was the first time I slept in our guest room, staring at the ceiling and wondering if our marriage could survive this. As the weeks passed, my mental health continued to deteriorate. The self-harming episodes became more frequent, a desperate attempt to find relief from the emotional numbness that had taken over my life. I tried to hide it from Marcus, but one morning he walked in on me changing and saw the marks on my arms. Instead of concern, his face showed disgust. He called my behavior selfish and attention-seeking. He said I was making everything about me and my grief with no consideration for how it was affecting him. His reaction only pushed me further into isolation and shame. I began seeing a therapist twice weekly, trying to develop healthier coping mechanisms. I invited Marcus to join me for a session, to help him understand what I was going through. But he always had an excuse not to attend. Work meetings, client dinners, gym sessions, anything to avoid confronting the reality of my struggle. Meanwhile, Jake had become an unexpected source of support. Having gone through his own painful divorce,